The first time Ava Moreno dreamed of the waiting room, it smelled like wet wool and candle wax. It was not the emergency room where she had watched her brother lose his heartbeat after the warehouse fire. It was not the ICU where her father once survived a stroke. It was a room she could not place in any map of her town, yet recognized with a bone-deep familiarity. A place that should have been frightening but was not. People moved silently there. Not the silence of despair, but the hush of a library where everyone reads the same luminous page. When she woke, her California king felt suddenly too wide. Her husband, Grant, breathed steadily on his side, long arm thrown over the quilt. The dog groaned at the foot of the bed. Outside, the November rain plucked at the gutters like an impatient metronome. Ava stared at the ceiling and said a line she had not said since she was 9 years old, and Sister Adela taught her that sometimes the simplest prayers travel the farthest. God, help me understand. By mid-morning, the waiting room had receded like mist, but it left a trace. The way smoke leaves sweetness in a sweater even after you've aired it out. Ava went about her usual Saturday workful: laundry, groceries, scanning Grant's basketball schedule for the weekend, setting a reminder for her mother's anniversary mass, yet all the while she was thinking of that room. It called up odd details from childhood: the little side chapel at St. Michael's with chipped blue tiles, the box of wax drippings under the votive rack, her grandmother's voice telling her there are places designed not to punish but to prepare. Purgatory is a waiting room, her grandmother used to say, tapping the dome of Ava's head with a knuckle while they shelled peas at the kitchen table. Not a dungeon. Not a dead end. A waiting room of love. Do not forget the love. She would then cross herself quickly, as if to keep from saying more than she should. Love was not the first word that came to mind when people spoke of purgatory. Ava knew that. She taught American literature at the community college and could quote the grim passages from Dante that her students underlined with a mix of horror and pleasure. But her grandmother's words had burrowed into some interior pocket and stayed there, like a seed waiting for rain. Rain found it the day her brother died. The fire had started just after dawn when a space heater kicked under a pallet of solvents in a warehouse near the river. Reporters later called it a stubborn fire, the kind that crouches like an animal in corners and keeps finding oxygen. Leo, who had been a firefighter for 12 years, went in on the first rotation. He was 36, a father of 2. The kind of man who picked up a stranger's dropped backpack and jogged it to the door. He had laughed on the phone with Ava the night before about a new recipe for hot wings and promised to bring her his perfected spice blend on Sunday after Mass. He wore a rubber wristband from a charity run and a St. Florian medal on a ball chain under his gear. When the roof fell in, the second team pulled him out in under 2 minutes. The paramedics did everything they knew how to do. The rain was still falling when the white sheet covered his face. At the wake, the fire chief placed the Floridian medal in Ava's palm. Her father, silent behind his mustache, kept one hand on top of the casket as if to steady the earth. Her mother's rosary clicked like rain on a tin roof. Paramedics with sleeve tattoos and eyes that had seen worse stood in the back of the funeral home and made the sign of the cross when the chaplain whispered the prayers. A young woman in a wool cap who had once been pulled from a basement by Leo stood in line and said she owed him her son's 6th birthday. No one knew what to do with the anger in the room. The feeling that a debt had been paid by someone who did not owe it. In the weeks after, Ava alternated between numbness and the sharpest clarity she had ever known. She felt like she could see the exact outline of things. the way the rain darkens the edges of paving stones. There were days she did not turn on a single light. Days she washed the same drinking glass twice. There were days she yelled at God and then apologized for yelling. The way a child might yell at her father for being late 5 minutes and then crawl into his lap. 3 months after the funeral, she had the dream of the waiting room. She did not tell Grant. She did tell a woman named Margot who ran the parish book table in the vestibule after the 9 o'clock mass. Ava had gone to the table to find a sympathy card. Maybe. Or a booklet of prayers she would pretend to read and then leave on the counter by the keys. Instead, she saw a title that felt like a hand catching her sleeve. Fire of Love, Reflections on Purgatory. Based on the writings of a saint she did not know much about. Catherine of Genoa. The cover said, in an elegant script, "That one's strong medicine." Margot said in a voice like hot tea. Not terrifying, though. Clear like a window after you've washed it when you didn't know how dirty it was. Ava bought the book and read the first 60 pages in the parking lot while the defroster scoured her windshield. She read lines that felt less like instruction and more like recollection. Purgatory is not a place where God hammers us. It is a place where His love burns away everything that keeps us from seeing Him as He is. The worst suffering there is not fire but delay. The ache of being created to behold and being unable to bear the sight because one's eyes are clouded. She thought of the waiting room again. How no one seemed to be counting minutes on a clock. And yet time mattered. That night, she placed the book on the bedside table with a pencil and a pad of sticky notes. She opened to a chapter that began with a metaphor about bread. If the whole world had only one loaf left and you were starving, Catherine wrote, seeing the bread would both thrill you and torment you. In hell, the loaf is always visible and always receding. In purgatory, you know the loaf will be placed in your hands. And that certainty makes the hunger bearable. Ava put the book down and wept for the first time in weeks. When she finally slept, the waiting room was there again. And this time, she recognized a figure sitting by the door. Her brother did not speak. He was younger than at the funeral. Maybe 25. Hair not yet flecked with gray. The skin at the corners of his eyes looked faintly sunburned, as it had after August games in the high school baseball tournament. He held a rosary in his right hand with a patience that had never been patient in life. He did not lift his eyes to hers, and she understood, with the clarity of a bell, that this was not a place for words yet. It was a place for readiness. She woke before dawn and drove to the church. St. Michael's sits on a slight rise above the river. A low brick building with a white steeple and a statue of Mary under a blue mantle that always seems the exact same color no matter the sky. On winter mornings, the vestibule smells like wet coats and beeswax. The confessional light glimmers behind an old red lens that Father Elias says he's been meaning to replace for 15 years. Ava knelt at the far end of the pew and watched the red light. It steadied her more than breath. She did not want to confess performatively, like a child rehearsing lines. She wanted to bring into the light the little resentments she had nourished like pets after Leo died. The words were awkward, then ordinary, then like stones laid down one after another until you notice you've been carrying a sack. When Father Elias raised his hand in absolution, his voice wavered on the final syllable as if he had grown old in the last year without telling anyone. Ava left the confessional in that January light where everything is revealed without mercy and found that mercy is the revealing. The next day, She met with the spiritual director her friend whispered about but never named in public because people either get weird or needy when you say spiritual director. Her name was Sister Leonie. She wore navy slacks and a long cardigan and a wooden cross on a cord. Her eyes were the color of ocean glass. She asked Ava the questions mechanics ask engines and doctors ask hearts. Have you forgiven yourself for not making life fair? Do you know that grief is a sacrament that continues to pour what you need if you return to it with empty hands? Will you practice silence without using it to get a result? Ava laughed softly at the last one, because she had already caught herself judging silence by outcome. She set the phone on airplane mode after dinner and sat in the chair near the window until the dog's sighs reshaped the quiet. She counted her breaths until she lost track and then started again. She did not say Leo's name in her mind because she did not want to tug. She did not worry about whether she was praying correctly because she had no energy left for correct. She sat so God could do whatever God does when people stop doing. In the weeks that followed, the waiting room dream did not return, and she did not need it to. The world took on new contours without changing its shape. Her students wrote essays comparing American pastoral literature with the reality of the climate report. Her inbox filled with petitions and proofs and a link to a video of a fight on the city green that left a teenager with a broken nose. Comment sections roared like swollen rivers. She wanted very much to write a paragraph sharp enough to hurt the right people. Instead, she drove to the green with a bag of salt and a box of tea candles. The town was the town, trash cans knocked over. A young mother pushing a stroller with a blanket flapping. An old man in a wool cap feeding a squirrel he pretended not to care about. Ava sat on a bench and opened fire of love again. Catherine reminded her that we cannot clean ourselves efficiently like kitchen counters. We can only present ourselves to the flame that knows what to do. 2 days later, she saw a flyer on the parish bulletin board printed on blue paper with the word vigil at the top. People were planning to gather on the green the next Tuesday for a candlelight hour to pray for mercy, for safety, for the conversion of hearts hard on both sides of too many arguments. A man in the vestibule muttered that vigils were for people who hated the police. A woman in the pew whispered that vigils were for people who loved the police too much. Ava did not want to be in the middle of that tether tug. She wanted kindness that did not flinch. She signed her name to help set up the night of the vigil. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour and the wind knifed down from the hills. Men and women from every corner of the town arrived with hats pulled low and children with mitten strings trailing and batteries for flickering tea lights. 2 officers stood at a respectful distance. A group from the shelter clustered together. Shoulders hunched. Eyes on the edges. The mayor shivered in a wool coat and said nothing, which Ava counted as a kind of wisdom. Father Elias asked for one volunteer to read the Magnificat aloud, and a woman Ava had never seen before stepped forward without ceremony. Her voice cracked on the line about the hungry. When the crowd finished the hymn, the square fell into that exquisite silence that feels like oxygen rushing into a room after a fire. A gust blew out half the candles and people relit them from one another's cups without murmur. The wind subsided. A toddler laughed. A snowflake drifted under the streetlight and melted on Ava's glove like a blessing that had no reason to choose her and chose her anyway. The next morning, she found a letter in her mailbox without a stamp. The handwriting was careful. The kind of careful that comes from trying very hard to be taken seriously. Thank you for the candle. Please pray for my brother. He is scared sometimes at night. My mom says God hears us anyway. We are learning to say Hail Mary. Love. Ren. Ava set the letter by the fruit bowl and wrote the name on an index card she kept on the counter now. A list of the living and the dead. Leo's name was at the top. Beneath it she wrote Ren's brother. Then in smaller letters, a coworker's mother. A student with a fragile spine. A neighbor with a brittle laugh. She lit a votive in the kitchen at dusk and read the names. It did not feel like productivity. It felt like placing bread on a plate and trusting that a table extends past what she could see. As Lent approached, Sister Leonie asked Ava to consider a practice, which made Ava mad instantly because she knew it would help. Go to confession regularly. Yes. Pray for the dead by name. Yes. But also, fast from complaining. Ava wanted to argue that complaining was cathartic. That complaint is sometimes the language of justice. Sister Leonie nodded and said, "It can be. When you are speaking for someone with less power. It is not when you are speaking for your own quick relief. Try it for 40 days. Offer the itch to speak for someone whose name you write on that card." That afternoon, the English department hosted a panel discussion about Dante and the afterlife that turned uncivil after one professor claimed the doctrine of purgatory was invented to sell indulgences and another countered by listing early church fathers and mispronouncing 3 of their names. Ava moderated clumsily, knowing that the students would go home and tell their roommates that 2 people with doctorates had fought like tired siblings. She went home and failed at the fast from complaining by delivering a spirited speech about academic pride to Grant, who listened and cut vegetables and said, gently, "You are grieving. So are they. Probably. Everyone's just worse at grief than they think." She apologized to God and then to her husband and then to the dog. Because she had raised her voice and the dog always took that personally. At bedtime, she read a few pages more of Catherine. The saint spoke of how souls in purgatory no longer thought of themselves or compared timelines or raged against delays. Because delay would be worse if one let the mind turn inward and gnaw. Instead, the souls allowed the fire to do its work and even, in a way unfathomable on earth, rejoice that it did. The fire hurt as much as truth hurts when you encounter it after living long in a lie. The pain was real. The joy was more real. Palm Sunday came with brittle sunshine and palms that shed their strings onto the pews. After Mass, Ava noticed a young man standing alone by the statue of Our Lady of Sorrows with his hands jammed into his jacket pockets, like he was trying not to ask for anything. She walked up slowly the way you walk up to a skittish horse and asked if he wanted to light a candle. He shrugged, which in certain grammar means yes. He lit one, and the candle flared and then steadied. "Do you think anybody hears?" he asked. "I think God hears," Ava said. And she said it with the confidence of someone who knows what it is to be heard by no one and to find that not the same as being unheard by God. The young man nodded once, as if he wanted to be convinced by someone else's conviction and could borrow it for an hour. On Holy Thursday, after the altar had been stripped and the church had emptied, Ava remained in the pew with a few others and listened to the pipes groan as the heat clicked off. Somewhere in the shadows a water fountain dripped. She pictured the waiting room again. And this time she saw more than faces. She saw the way the souls were turned toward the door. Not anxiously, but like flowers that had learned the sun's schedule. She remembered Catherine's image of gold in the crucible, how the impurities rise to the surface as foam and are skimmed away by a craftsman's steady hand. What if that is Leo right now? She thought, with an ache that was both sorrow and gratitude. What if he is almost pure enough to bear the terrible tenderness of God's gaze? What if what remains is nothing but love? After the Triduum and the flood of lilies, when the church had returned to ordinary time with an almost audible exhale, the town erupted again. A judge released body cam footage of an arrest that had turned violent on Main Street. The footage told a story that someone else's footage contradicted. People drew hard lines in their throats. Some organized a protest for Saturday on the Green. Others planned a counter-protest at the same hour. The shelter asked for extra volunteers because strife is not abstract when you have nowhere to be. The police chief asked for prayers because he had to deploy officers who were God's children to protect other God's children from still other God's children. On Friday afternoon, Ava met with a small group in the parish hall to make sandwiches in plastic gloves. A man named Daryl, who worked nights at the plant, told them a story about his mother in Alabama who kept holy cards tucked into the frames of the living room family photos and covered the cards with dust cloths when the cousins visited because some of the cousins laughed. He said he did not want to be someone who laughed at the wrong things anymore. The group packed 40 brown bags and another 50 bottles of water into crates. They prayed not to do harm. They prayed to endure harm without returning it. They prayed to be faithful. Saturday came with a brutal white sun and air that made your teeth ache. By 2 o'clock, people had gathered. 2 lines of strangers faced one another across the sidewalk, each line certain that the other line was the problem. Ava stood at the edge of the green with a crate of water and a box of yarn-wrapped candles and tried not to meet anyone's eyes in a way that might be mistaken for challenge. The shouting started. Someone knocked into someone else. A baby cried. An older woman murmured a prayer fast under her breath, like throwing down sand on ice. Then, in a moment that did not feel like strategy or luck, a man stepped from the line of counter-protesters and took a bottle of water from Ava's crate and handed it to a woman not on his side. It was nothing. It was everything. The woman took it, and her shoulders dropped 1 inch. The man stepped back, and the world did not end. Someone else helped a toddler pick up a glove that had fallen. A third person stopped yelling mid-syllable and laughed at himself without malice. Ava felt like a stream had been redirected by a stone a child could lift. The police chief nodded at her across the square. He had been a member of St. Michael's for years, but did not come often. His wife came every first Friday with a casserole. His son had moved to Colorado. He took off his hat and scratched his head as if the whole scene made his scalp itch in a surprisingly hopeful way. By late afternoon, the crowd thinned without resolution. No one changed allegiance. No one erased a line in their heart and drew a new one. But some people drank water they had not paid for. Some people handed yarn-wrapped candles across the sidewalk. Some people walked home without a bruise they might have otherwise earned. Ava carried the empty crates back to her car and sat for a long time with her hands still. She had spent weeks fasting from complaining. It had not made her a saint. It had not fixed the way she wanted the world to be fixed. Which is to say, over and done with so she could rest. It had made space in her for something she could not take credit for. It had taught her that some fires you do not fight with water. You endure them and let them do their work. And you do not pretend the work is painless. And you do not call the pain good. But you recognize that good comes because God is unrelentingly good. That night, Ava dreamed of the waiting room again. She stood by the door this time. A figure beside her held her hand. It was not Leo. It was not anyone she could name. The figure pointed through the glass. And Ava saw a light so clean she had to look away and then back. The way you do with the first snow on a bright day. She understood without argument that those who waited did not beg to leave, because begging would be a kind of selfishness. And selfishness had no oxygen there. They longed without complaint. They burned without bitterness. They looked toward the door with such trust that Ava's throat went tight. When she woke, she carried that trust into the kitchen and lit a candle by the index card. She wrote a new name, a teenager arrested on Main Street who looked small without the camera angle. She wrote the officer's badge number because that was the name she had. And she trusted God to fill in the gaps. Then, because it was Sunday, she put on black pants and a white sweater and drove to church. That morning, Father Elias preached a homily that would not trend. He said purgatory is good news, that we are not finished when we die, that God refuses to let a single stain remain to cloud our seeing. He said the dead long for our prayers, not because heaven is transactional, but because the church is a body, and bodies feel what happens in their parts. He said we should go to confession not because God forgets and needs a reminder, but because we forget and need to remember that love still wants us. He said the most dangerous thing in his pastoral experience was not anger, which is often grief in disguise, but cynicism, which is despair with a college degree. He said the line between a person in purgatory and a person on earth is permeable in one direction, the direction of love. After Mass, an older parishioner named Agnes approached Ava with eyes wet in the corners and asked if she would organize a Mass for the dead on the first Thursday of every month with the reading of names. Agnes had lost a daughter 20 years earlier. She said the town had taught itself to be embarrassed by the way grief returns in anniversary tides. The church must refuse embarrassment. Ava said yes before the sentence ended. The first month, 12 people came. They read 50 names while beeswax candles sputtered. A man in work boots knelt and made the sign of the cross the way his father had taught him before the divorce. The second month, 20 people came. Then 35. A parish volunteer began printing the names on thin paper slips to burn in a brass bowl afterward. A gesture that would not convince an empiricist, but comforted the grieving in the same way the pouring of water comforts a garden. A woman from the shelter arrived with a slip that had no last name, only the first name of a friend. These are prayers God knows how to assign, Father Elias said. In June, Ava drove to the cemetery on a day when the headstones gleamed like bones. She stood at Leo's grave with its simple bronze plaque and St. Florian's embossed shield. She told her brother about Wren and the candle letter and the Mass for names. She told him about the vigil where the wind made people share fire. She told him about the argument in the English department that now made her laugh. She told him she missed his knuckles knocking on her door 3 times in a pattern that meant let me in with coffee. Then she did something that was not dramatic. She forgave a person who had said an unkind thing at the funeral. She forgave herself for thinking she should have saved anyone from anything. She forgave God for letting the world have its way sometimes, and then remembered that forgiveness was not the theological category that fit God, and laughed at herself gently for trying to make the Almighty a defendant in a case without jurisdiction. The next day, a postcard arrived in the mail with a picture of the Gulf Coast and 6 words in a child's tight pen. We are praying the Hail Mary. It was from Wren. Ava placed it behind the fruit bowl like a talisman. She took up her index card and added a line, every person whose name I do not know but whose face I have seen. She folded the card in half and slid it under the candle so that the heat would not take it too fast. She waited and watched. The flame moved, not with drama, but with purpose. It left no ash except a trace that smelled like a coat closet in winter. On a Wednesday in late July, Ava's mother called with a funny story about a neighbor's cat wearing a sweater. They laughed so hard Ava had to sit down on the floor. On a Thursday in August, the shelter called for fans because the heat was nightmarish in the dormitory. Ava posted once on the parish Facebook page and 60 people delivered fans by 5. On a Monday in September, a college freshman in Ava's composition class wrote a narrative about his grandfather's death and included a description of how silence in the hospital room felt like a velvet blanket. Ava wrote in the margin that velvet can scratch if you stroke it the wrong way. A fact survivors know from experience. When autumn came around again with its merciless beauty, the town council cut the shelter's budget after a meeting that lasted beyond midnight. Comment sections broke open like infected wounds. People on both sides knew the other side by the worst member of that side. Ava attended a council member's office hours and said gently that budgeting is unimaginably hard and that she would not shout at a person doing such work even if the person made the wrong call. The council member cried for 30 seconds into a napkin she pulled from her sleeve. In the vestibule after Mass one Sunday, a man approached Ava and said he did not like the church talking about purgatory because it frightened his granddaughter. Ava asked how old the granddaughter was. 6, he said. Ava said her grandmother told her that purgatory is God's hospital, where he bandages what we refuse to bandage here. She said no one in purgatory wants to leave early. Not because pain is good, but because the door leads to a face no one wants to meet without radiance. The man looked down at his hands and said quietly that his wife had died in March. He wondered every day if she resented him for living. Ava said she doubted resentment fits through that door. On a frostbitten night in November, a year and a week after Leo's death, Ava stood in St. Michael's beside the brass bowl where paper names had become smoke that rose through the rafters. The church was not crowded. Dozens, not hundreds. The prayers were old. The silence was not empty. Father Elias placed the ciborium on the altar and paused, as if even now it surprises him that bread becomes God. Ava closed her eyes and thought of gold in a crucible, of bread in hungry hands, of love that refuses to quit because quitting would contradict its nature. She thought of the waiting room and of the figure who held her hand at the door. She did not ask to see Leo in her dream again. She did not need permission to hope he was near. She did not require verification from heaven because she had been given work on earth. She folded up her grief like a quilt now worn soft at the edges and placed it over the shoulders of others when the wind picked up. After Mass, she stepped onto the church steps. The Marian statue wore a coat of early snow. Somewhere down on the green, someone's dog barked. A siren wailed and stopped. The night smelled like wood smoke and the faint chemical sweetness of the paper mill. Ava pulled her coat close. Not against the cold, but in gratitude that the cold could still wake her. She walked to her car and sat for a long minute with her hands on the steering wheel and said the line with which she had begun this whole chapter of her life. God, help me understand. The answer did not arrive as new information. It arrived as presence the way heat arrives in a room where the register has been humming unnoticed. It arrived as a suggestion so simple she nearly missed it. Do what you can for the living. Pray for the dead. Let my love burn what it must. Refuse to despair. Refuse to return harm. Learn to wait like someone who knows the door opens. She drove home and set water to boil for tea. She pulled an index card from the stack and wrote 3 names. She lit a candle and watched the flame find the wick. She did not hurry it. She did not tell it what to do. She closed her eyes and thought not of waiting but of welcoming. Not of delay, but of completion. Not of fire as punishment, but of fire as the necessary cost of seeing clearly. When the dog thumped her tail against the cabinet and asked to be let out, Ava laughed and did the ordinary thing God had in mind all along. She opened the door. The porch light carved a soft circle on the first dusting of snow. Across the street, a neighbor in a wool cap waved with an economy born of decades. Somewhere in town, people were doing harm to people. Somewhere else, people were right now interrupting harm without headlines. The world tore and stitched and tore again. Ava held in herself the knowledge that there is a room where the torn are made whole carefully, without haste, with a love that does not apologize for being particular. She held also in herself the knowledge that she could live in such a way as to begin that work now. Here, on streets salted for winter, she resolved to greet arguments with a patience that did not make her a doormat. She resolved to speak for people whose voices were thin. She resolved to take her sins to the place where names are read and blame is burned with paper into a scent that lingers on coats. She resolved to tell her students that waiting is not weakness when what you are waiting for is worth it. She resolved to remind her parish that the doctrine of purgatory insults cynicism by insisting on hope. She resolved to become, in whatever small way she could,